All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to our Ask a Greenhouse Expert webinar series hosted by Ceres Greenhouse Solutions. We're so happy to have you as we dive into the topic of greenhouse growing systems. My name is Haley, and I'll be the facilitator for today's event. We have a couple of changes for this month's webinar. Unfortunately, our greenhouse expert Mark could not make today's session, so Josh alone will be representing Ceres. Also, we are introducing a guest speaker appearance from Tawnya Sawyer, who will be speaking in place of her husband, JD Sawyer. Tawnya is co-owner of the Aquaponic Source and will be answering all your aquaponics related questions, as well as sharing her wisdoms on systems in general. Thank you, Tawnya, for being here. But before we get into it, I'd like to briefly introduce Ceres, the Aquaponic Source, and our panelists. Ceres Greenhouse Solutions is a company devoted to designing and engineering energy-efficient growing systems. Beyond providing a well-designed facility, Ceres integrates appropriate technology and focused data and fosters smart partnerships to create growing spaces that both consider the environment and make financial sense. And then I'm going to briefly introduce Josh, who is our systems integration specialist. Since starting at Ceres 13 years ago, Josh has created the cannabis division, helped design the Ceres Sun Chamber, and developed the Vesta Kit House, bringing more than a decade of experience in design, construction, and cultivation. Josh approaches his job with an interdisciplinary understanding of systems, architectural design, and problem solving. His goal is to create a whole systems approach to both greenhouse design and environmental controls, resulting in the most efficient systems and highest quality product. And we have Tawnya Sawyer, co-owner of the Aquaponic Source, as mentioned. Since 2009, Tawnya and JD Sawyer have been growing, educating, engineering, and innovating around the field of aquaponics in controlled environments. They build and operated an aquaponic farm in partnership with the Grow House, a nonprofit organization focused on advanced food justice through food access, wellness education, and leadership development. In the Denver area, they also collaborated on a 5,000 square foot aquaponic greenhouse with WellPoint campus for health and well-being, centering on food as the first form of medicine. In 2015, the Sawyers purchased the Aquaponic Source, a company focused on home aquaponic systems and supplies. Since then, the team has dramatically expanded the home and school-based aquaponic systems while also adding Flourish Farms, modular aquaponic farm systems that are designed to maximize floor space and potential for profitability. For the past several years, the team at the Aquaponic Source has been designing and installing home, school, and commercial farm systems all over North America. They work daily with teachers, home hobbyists, nonprofit organization leaders, and commercial farmers to ensure that aquaponics is a key piece in the future of agriculture. And I'm Haley Liddell, as mentioned. I am the content marketing manager at Ceres Greenhouse Solutions. I want to thank everyone who submitted growing systems related questions during registration. We'll be answering as many of those as we can, and we invite attendees to ask questions at any given point in the Q&A section. Please keep questions relevant to the topic at hand. Just a reminder that this webinar is being recorded and we'll make it available to everyone on demand afterwards. Really quickly before we get into it, I want to read a quick disclaimer. The information provided during this webinar is for general informational purposes only and is based on the expertise and knowledge of our greenhouse specialists. The advice and recommendations provided are intended to assist attendees in understanding various greenhouse systems. Participants are encouraged to consult with a qualified professional or conduct further research to address any specific concerns or requirements they may have. The hosts and organizers of this webinar are not responsible for any actions taken based on the information presented. Awesome. All right, let's get into it with our first question. Before we get into the specifics of all the systems, I wanted to take a step back and ask, what sort of considerations should growers take into account when choosing a growing system that is right for them? Maybe Tawnya, you want to start us off?
Sure. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yep.
Great. So we get this question all the time, and people often think that they have to pick one type of growing method or another. We always tell them to figure out what their goals are. So is this just for home and personal consumption, and you like a variety of foods, and so you want a lot of crop diversity, but you're not worried about selling it or anything like mass production? Or on the flip side, do you really need to make this profitable because you're a commercial grower that has to pay the bills for this thing? Those are two very, very different types of growing decisions. A third scenario might be, we do a lot of work with universities and schools who want to create job training opportunities, skills development, or research. And so your goal, what it is you're trying to accomplish, should be the very first thing you have to figure out before you even select any type of a growing system.
Yeah, and hello everyone, and Haley, thanks for that amazing introduction. That was very well done. The other thing that we think about is resources in your area. So oftentimes we'll say, how often do you have power outages? If it's a place that's kind of rural that has a lot of power outages, NFT full hydro maybe isn't a great idea because you're going to have plant loss, or the cost of a generator might be more than the budget of the whole greenhouse. And so we always think about little things like what Tawnya said, and what's available in your area to help determine what makes the most sense for your growing goals.
Great. Thank you so much for that. Let's get into aquaponics. What is the smallest starter building that you suggest for hydroponics using fish and plants?
Well, aquaponics can grow on a desktop. So if you wanted a 10-gallon aquarium, that could be a possible entry point. That's how we started our lives as aquapons, we'll say. We thought it would be fun for our kids to be able to feed the fish and the fish to grow some little plants, but we couldn't get enough. That was not enough for us. And so we looked at having a greenhouse on our own home, and we put on about 300 square feet originally. Then we started working with the community, and they had a greenhouse space that needed refurbishing with the grow house. So we moved to 3,000 square feet. From there, we expanded at MHCD with 5,000 square feet. So for us, one size wasn't enough. We have worked with tons and tons of growers. And again, this goes back to your goal. Homeowners and hobbyists who want to grow for themselves might be able to fit nicely in, say, 150 to 500 square feet attached to their house. But if they're going to start growing commercially, we would say a good minimum consideration for a small community might be 3,000-ish square feet. But we've seen growing operations that we've completed all the way to 10,000, and we're working on a 20,000 square foot. So it really just depends on the market and the intention of what you're attempting to grow based on volume.
Yeah, and so Ceres has worked with the Aquaponic Source and what was Colorado Aquaponics for a long time. And I've known JD and Tawnya for a long time as well, because personally, I had an aquaponics greenhouse very randomly a long time ago.
Yep.
But when we started with Ceres, I think our first projects were 10-foot by 12-foot greenhouses.
Yeah.
So that's 120 square feet.
Yep.
There was 2 media beds. They were little.
Perfect. Yeah.
And people had a fish tank, and they were growing, vine crops, tomatoes, and now most of our work with Aquaponic Source is 3,000 square footers that are basically small scale but fully commercial lettuce production greenhouses for profit and community benefit.
Absolutely. Yeah, you don't want to build something so big that you have the cost, obviously, of the capital outlay and also operations. So you've got to right size the purpose of what you're growing and the building that you're going to grow it in. And we've worked with clients who want to have both a growing space, and if they're not selling commercially, they might also have that space include things like a beautiful koi pond, a sitting area, you know, place to do their yoga. Like there could be a combination of wonderful aspects to a building, but clearly if they're planning this for commercial purposes, food safety is a key factor, and they want to just focus on the crop itself.
Another really nice thing when we're talking about little to big with aquaponics in particular is that water chemistry is water chemistry. And so if you can learn how to create good water chemistry at a small scale,
Yep.
with minimal with small repercussions if your water chemistry gets out of whack,
Yep.
you now have a skill set that will allow you to expand and feel much more confident about expanding. And so aquaponics in particular, starting small is really a beneficial thing.
Yeah, that's always our recommendation. I can't say that we did that. We started small and then went 3,000 square feet. So, and lots of our farmers kind of jump right in and go and are successful.
Well, I think that goes really well into our next question, which is how do I manage nutrient levels in hydroponics or aquaponics?
So there's two ways to approach this. Obviously with aquaponics, we're trying to mimic a natural ecosystem. You feed the fish produce waste. The waste is filtered through a variety of filtration mechanisms that performs nitrification, which allows the water to be returned to the fish healthy and safe, removing things like ammonia and nitrite, but provides a fertilizer source for those plants. So in aquaponics, we tend to rely on the fish and the fish feed that are our base of nutrients. And then depending on our water supply, we may also need to include things like calcium or potassium. If you're on a well, you may have calcium readily available through the limestone, for example. Iron may be readily available in a well because if you have those little orange drips on your toilet or sink, you have high iron content. And so it's possible that you may not have to do much adjusting with aquaponics. On a farm scale, we tend to manage pH and the nutrients of calcium, potassium, and iron for the plants because those things aren't readily available in fish feed. If you're growing hydroponically, and Josh can probably speak to this as well, you tend to use either an organic nutrient solution made from, you know, plant material, compost teas, and things like that. Or if you're growing commercially and you want to specifically focus on certain nutrients, you would use powdered forms of chemical compounds designed for plant production.
Yeah, and Tawnya, maybe speak to like a decoupled system where
Sure.
I know you design where it's a fish-focused system, but if your water chemistry is going awry, or maybe you do a fish harvest and they're not producing enough nutrition for the plants, you can separate the two systems?
Yeah, for sure. So in aquaponics, a coupled system means the fish tanks and the plants are connected directly together. The water is flowing between these two. In a decoupled setup, which we often create for the purpose of when the fish are very young, if there was a fish die-off or disease issue, if the plants need certain pest regimens that aren't healthy for the fish. In a decoupled setting, there's a series of valves, and those valves can be adjusted or turned off. And by doing so, the fish system is independently operated and the plant system is independently operated. Usually what we do though is still want to capture the nutrients from the fish. So we pass the fish water over to the plant side, allowing all of those good nutrients to provide their resources to the plants, but we don't return the water from the plants back to the fish. If we need an extra boost, we use organically approved nutrients, which would not be harmful to the fish. They're actually made from fermented vegetable byproducts that have been composted down. They have wonderful fulvic acids, amino acids that the plants need. And so we're not using anything synthetic in there that's going to build up over time and cause some sort of salinity issues or concerns for the fish in the long term.
Great. For the next question, I have, what are the potential environmental benefits of hydroponics or aquaponics?
Josh, I've talked a lot. Do you want to jump on that, or I'll say what I have to say?
My initial thought with hydro and or aquaponics, I think if we're just looking at the plants, we can kind of look at them production wise in a similar way. It is very consistent, and can be very water economical. So these are water-based systems, but they're very efficient with water. So it requires a large quantity of water potentially to do this, but that water lasts a really long time. When you're growing in soil, and we'll talk about this more later, but you put water in the ground, some of it drains away, a small percentage of it is transpired through the plants, but it is not particularly water efficient, whereas a aqua or hydroponic system, I mean, Tawnya, you can tell me, maybe uses 10% of the water.
10%.
I mean,
that's typically quoted as the 10%, absolutely. And that is the fact that it's recirculated through the system. So we did this at home, and commonly at Grow House, we had outdoor garden spaces that were soil based. And I have nothing against soil. I want everyone to know. People are like, why do you hate soil? I'm like, I love soil. I just wish it could be more productive in Colorado, where it's really hot and dry. So if you poured, say, 50 gallons of water on a dirt or a soil garden bed, it will evaporate, it will absorb, it will run off, just because it gets almost a crusty layer. But not all of that may get to the roots. In aquaponics or hydroponics, that water is circulated through the system, and a certain amount of it transpires into the building, but the building actually holds in that humidity and moisture and improves the growth of the plants, because all of it's there in that space. And so we conserve water significantly over crop production out in a field, for example.
And I had someone in the chat ask, can you use rainwater capture? Do you have people that do that, or clients?
Very good question. In certain places, so we have clients on island nations where rainwater is kind of their only form of fresh water. The one challenge to this, actually, there's a few. One of the challenges with rainwater is it tends to be low pH, acidic, because it can't hold carbon sources like calcium, potassium, or magnesium. And so that low pH, say 4.5 or 5.0, would prevent it from being able to be very useful to the fish or plants without adjusting that pH up, bringing it up. The other thing is, when you're doing rain catchment, unless it's falling straight out of the sky into a container, and again, in island nations, a lot of times they would have fish tanks outside, for example, or plant production in outdoor growing spaces without a greenhouse, and the water would just rain down in the system, and that would collect it effectively. But if you're trying to allow it to roll off of a building, there's going to be, pollen residues, potentially any type of contaminants that would come in the air, bird droppings, and other things that would make that water need to be sanitized in some sort of way before we could make use of it. So we tend to suggest well water or city municipal water would be the right source to start our aquaponic system and run it long term. Hydro would be the same.
And one of the things that we offer, as a building and system supplier, would be it would be a treatment and potentially fertigation system, or whatever it is, to plug into aquaponics or hydro, where the building can capture the water. The building has a metal roof or a polycarbonate roof or some kind of glazing that will hold dust and pollen and other things that Tawnya was just saying into a usually submerged collection tank of some sort with a sand oil filter of some sort. And then we would potentially even go somewhere to like a reverse osmosis system, which we try and not use, but if it's rainwater and you're losing 40% of rainwater, it's a much better scenario than if you're losing 40% of potable water to a waste stream. So it is very doable. again, it's just all about which systems you choose to get that water to its final state, which would also be a pH up dosing, as well as anything else, to get it to where it needs to be. And I think it's probably worthwhile, while we're talking about pH, why don't you just discuss the best pH real quick, and how maybe the plants and the fish need something different, and there's a magic middle spot for that for aquaponics?
Yeah, pH is a good one. I mean, it is a critical part of growing plants effectively. And there's a lot of literature out there, a lot of YouTube videos out there. Folks, universities have kind of come to some pretty finite conclusions after growing millions of plants. The pH at a neutral level, a 7.0, tends to split the difference between fish like high pH 7 to 9, for example, because they have to maintain their slime coat. So a high pH alkalinity promotes that kind of quality of life for a fish. Bacteria can thrive in that same range. And remember, in aquaponics, we're producing and employing literally good bacteria that are performing nitrification and breaking down fish solids into a nutrient solution for the plants. The plants like their pH to be somewhat lower, 6.5 to about 6.8. Some plants like tomatoes would even like it more acidic. And the flavor of the plant can change, or the quality of the budding or the fruit crop production can change based on the way the pH is along that spectrum. With that in mind, we tend to provide very specific sort of dosing to basically continuously increase pH, because the bacteria, as they consume nitrogen and change it from ammonia to nitrate, they will also consume alkalinity. They consume the carbon source in the water. So that has to be replenished on an ongoing basis, either with topping off the water or adding something like calcium. And so it's a balancing act. We want to make sure the plants are happy, the bacteria is happy, the fish are happy. In hydroponics, you don't have to be quite so concerned, because fish can't take big swings in pH. And because many hydroponic systems are actually sterile environments by choice, their mechanisms for controlling pH are fairly specific. They don't have to worry about the fish or bacteria dying if they were to put the pH down at 5.8 to make the acid-loving plants really happy.
Awesome. And then I guess that little segue nicely into this next question, which is, how do you avoid harmful fungus and bacteria in your system, in the aquaponic system? Sure.
Any growing environment can have potential for pathogens. So your garden, if you were to look outside right now, your little plants in your house, in a greenhouse, you have the perfect spa day, we'll say, for funguses, bacterias, and pests. So the number one thing we tell people is that they, as a human, are the vector of transmission. If you're mowing your lawn outside, if you're pulling weeds, if you're playing in your garden and then you go into your greenhouse, you're very likely the way that fungus or bacteria or pest gets into the building. And the minute it's in the building, on your clothes, your shoes, your hair, your hands, it will then replicate, because it has beautiful temperatures, 68 to 75. It has warm, moist air. It's got a tropical paradise, literally. And in most buildings, it doesn't have wind, snow, ice, rain, hot, heat, freezing conditions. And so it'll just proliferate. That's when you have to play Mother Nature, and you probably have to do something like use a regiment that will kill off a fungus or bacteria, use humidity control and air movement to prevent a buildup of humidity, use different sorts of spray methods or something like that to help capture and eradicate whatever it is that you're dealing with. And it may be a whole entire crop change. I mean, we've had instances where we've done it ourselves or someone else did. They had a powdery mildew outbreak they didn't stay on top of, or they had aphids that ate up all their plants. Or right now we have a farmer who has an open ridge vent with no screen, and moths flew in, and now he has 5 billion cutworms that are just eating up all of his basil. And so you, as a farmer, as a grower, you have to really stay on top of it and regiment. And I want to point it out that organic does not mean pesticide free. There are something like 232 different regimens that are organically approved that can be used to combat something. So you have to become the predator, basically, of a disease or a fungus or something like that.
Yeah, and there's also, in a closed environment, there's a whole knowledge base called integrated pest management, where you're introducing ladybugs, which, believe it or not, you can order in the mail. And as they reproduce, their offspring are eating a lot of aphid larvae. There's all kinds of things you do in a greenhouse to somewhat create a beneficial, realistic environment. The other thing we were discussing earlier, Tawnya, was with hydro, it's sterile. And so you think about, someone with no immune system, you can get sick very easily. But with aquaponics, it's a living system, and soil is somewhat the same way as well, where it has some built-in natural deterrents, right?
Yeah, that's a really good point. Plants have an immune system. And so the fabulous thing is, if that plant recognizes a stressor, for example, it's too hot, it's too cold, it's too humid, it's going to do something to attempt in some sort of ways to protect itself. On the flip side, Mother Nature puts in things like pests and diseases and funguses to start breaking down, say, old plant material. So if you're harvesting at a very predictable rate, you're reducing the amount of pressure that would be on that plant and helping it use its immune system to fight off something like that. But you're absolutely right. We were side by side with a hydroponic and our aquaponic growing environment. In their sterile environment, they would get 80% of their lettuce crop wiped out by Rhizoctonia, which is a disease that hits the stem of the plant. It grows to a full-size head, and about the day you're ready to harvest, it shrivels up, flops over, and dies. So you think everything's fine until you're like ready to harvest. We were right next door. We had an incident of Rhizoctonia at the very same time they did. Less than 1% of our crop was damaged by it, because the bacteria colony outcompeted the bad, in this case, Rhizoctonia disease, and it just didn't let it proliferate at the same rate it did in a sterile environment. Now, on the flip side, in hydroponics, you can use a lot more things to combat those diseases because you don't have to worry about the bacteria and fish being affected by them.
That is really interesting. Thank you, Tawnya. And then one more aquaponics specific question before we can start getting into more soil-based stuff. This is about the fish. What types of fish work best in aquaponic systems? And then we had someone ask, can you utilize harvestable fish?
Oh, absolutely. They're my favorite. So the beauty of aquaponics is that you can grow protein in your garden. There's not many other mechanisms that create that same thing. And if you've ever been interested in, say, farmsteading or homesteading, the idea of having diverse food supply is really a phenomenal thing. So that's kind of how we started. We had chickens, we had rabbits, we had goats, we had alpacas, our neighbor had bees. We wanted to diversify our food supply. And so fish seemed like the next logical leap. And frankly, having grown up growing animals for eggs, milk, and meat, I have to say the best one is the fish, because they don't make noise and they don't smell, and their manure is incredibly useful right away, where chicken manure or others are kind of hot. They've got too much nitrogen until it's broken down. So fish are fabulous. The most common fish used in aquaponics tends to be tilapia, and that's mainly because tilapia work well in tanks. They work well in crowded conditions. They work well in warm water, which is common in a greenhouse environment. They will eat anything, so they're easy to feed. They grow big and fat pretty fast, so they're harvestable fairly quickly in about a year from fingerling all the way up to plate size. And they're very social. Like they love to come at the tank as soon as you walk in. They're ready to eat, and they're just frolicking and excited to see you. Other fish that you can cohabitate with tilapia or you can grow independently would be catfish are fabulous. We've grown bluegill, we've grown perch, bass. In a cooler environment, trout can make a very great aquaponic fish, but it only works if you can keep your temperatures below about 65 degrees max. So if you're in a cold climate and you're not spending a lot of money on heating your building and it's not heating itself up dramatically, trout's a possibility. If for some reason harvesting fish is not your thing, you thought it was going to be your thing, but you really can't stand the idea of killing your now pets, never name your fish. Goldfish and koi are fabulous because they can grow very big. In fact, we have a couple koi that we've had for 14 years, and they're big as my thigh at this point. So you can have fish live a very long time.
And the koi are
And then
valuable.
one final note about that is if you had tanks of catfish, tilapia, bass, for example, and either different tanks or mixed together, if you're feeding them the same feed and they're living basically in the same water that's recirculating, they will taste the same. Even though their body structure is different, the flavor will be the same because of the conditions they live in.
A few thoughts on that. Koi to me is always just this crazy thing, but koi have huge value. Like you can sell koi and they're worth a lot of money. And oftentimes in farming, I've seen it with flowers versus food. Ornamental things are worth more than nutritious things.
Absolutely true.
That's kind of an interesting one. I'm not sure if you hit it, but dissolved oxygen or low dissolved oxygen levels for the fish. So tilapia can be jammed in a tank in a way that trout can't be, right? So
yeah, that's absolutely true. So it's common that, and when we're designing an aquaponic system, the size of tanks, aeration, filtration, water flow, pipe sizing, all that stuff is taken into consideration, and either heating or cooling the water, depending on the species of fish that we're trying to grow. A key part of that is to ensure that the fish have adequate dissolved oxygen. So if you think like a fish, a trout lives in a fast moving stream. And so they have lots of bubbles and aeration that are happening, and they usually are in high mountain lakes or rivers. And so they need those cool temperatures, and cool water actually holds a larger volume of oxygen. On the flip side, most of our greenhouse environments are automatically going to be warm to hot conditions in most cases. And the thermal mass of being in that greenhouse is going to heat the water over time and slowly release that temperature back into the building. So because of that, fish that prefer warm temperatures, tilapia work great for that, catfish work great for that. And we aerate the fish tanks to ensure that those fish have adequate oxygen supply that they need to grow big and strong, to digest, to complete all of their metabolic processes, and to thrive.
And then anecdotally, as far as using the fish or eating the fish, I know that when the Aquaponic Source says, here's your farm, there is a fish poundage and probably a fish value you can calculate in. My personal experience, I had 10,000 gallons of fish tank, was the easiest thing to do was perpetually harvest the fish. So I would invite my friends over and harvest 20 fish, and we'd have a very cool dinner.
Yep.
But it wasn't harvesting so much that we were affecting water quality. Because when you do a big harvest, you're also reducing the nutrient capability of the remaining fish, and then you have
Sure.
to compensate for that for the plants. And so, on a commercial scale, my take is that the fish is somewhat secondary. It's really a plant operation, and then there's a potential smaller fish operation. But Tawnya, maybe you speak to that, how your clients are dealing with the fish.
Yeah, so universities have defined this. There's several universities that are very involved with aquaponics, but commercially we see the same thing. Basically 10% of the floor space, 10% of the operating activity, 10% of the revenue is expected to be fish oriented in an aquaponic setting. And the other 90% of floor space, operational activity, and profitability are in the plants. Plants are rotated in a way that they're going to grow out very rapidly, versus the fish will take an entire year or more, sometimes depending on the type of fish, to grow to a plateable size. They also have to have the right feed conditions, temperature, age of fish, space in the tank, stocking density, all that stuff. So you're absolutely right that when we design the way the systems are set up, we're going to design the fish to have a small portion of it. In fact, with Ceres, we've done several separate attached spaces to a greenhouse where the fish live in something called a head house. It's a enclosed building that's designed just for the fish tanks, the filtration equipment, and other components. And then the growing space is all in the greenhouse side to promote plant growth.
And Haley, we've got Tawnya here, and she's an aquaponics expert. So I'm going to ask one more question because you mentioned the head house. Might as well take advantage. We see in greenhouses without the head house that oftentimes the tanks are tarped or shaded.
Yes.
And then we do greenhouses where we put the tanks in a fully insulated with an opaque insulated regular roof in a north room that's attached, but the tanks don't see sunlight. Can we talk about fish tanks seeing sunlight and advantages or disadvantages, or both, to those two different layouts?
Yeah, for sure. So a head house where the fish are separated in a physical room that usually doesn't have a lot of daylight, usually get lit in such a way that we can control fish behavior. They use the sun as a cue to do things like eat, swim around, get exercise, mate. We don't encourage that in the system, but sometimes it happens. And so when we design a setup where the fish are in their own room, a lot of times we will simulate day using lights, LED lights, for example, that are tuned with a particular spectrum of light for the purpose of helping those fish still have a happy life. But it's much easier to control things like their temperature, maintain food safety boundaries, allow pest regimens to be used in the greenhouse side of the building without affecting the fish, and manage some of the equipment in a more temperature controlled sort of space. So that would be a good reason why we'd separate those.
How about algae growth?
Absolutely, it improves algae growth or prevents algae growth, if we want to say it that way. Algae is anytime you're going to have water, light, and nutrients, you're going to have algae. It's Mother Nature's pioneer species that brings the first layer of life forms so that you can start accumulating other life forms. And so in a building that's blocked from the sun, you're going to have a lot less algae concerns because of that.
Yeah, cool.
Great. Well, that was a lot of incredible information about aquaponics. Thank you so much. Just because we have about 20 or so more minutes, I'd like to segue into soil-based questions, because we have a lot of clients that grow in the soil or in beds. I think I can sort of combine these two questions, but what sort of grow operation works well with soil-based, and can you elaborate on the difference in food quality between soil-based versus the other systems? Maybe Josh, if you want to take this one.
Yeah, I'm going to start. So with the water-based systems, I think we can agree that best case for that is often leafy greens, like fast crank through. You can do greens in a hydro aquaponic cycle in 4 weeks to full commercial size. You can't really do greens in the soil that fast. They go quickly, but not that fast. But in soil, what we see the most of is like big vining tomatoes and cucumbers that people plant early in a Ceres greenhouse. You can plant in February and keep it through January. You can do crazy things with these plants where they're not moving. It's not this rapid harvest. It's a long-term plant that is continuously harvestable. So everyone does still grow lettuce, and you can actually grow lettuce under your tomato plant. They want that shade, and it's a little bit cooler maybe, but you can really shift into different production or plant types in a soil-based system that work really well, whereas aquaponics might work better for this rapid fire lettuce and greens, herbs, things like that.
Yeah, I think my favorite greenhouses that I've seen that are soil-based, and I've seen quite a few that are either, yours, Golden Hoof, Crimpy, some domes. Some of the most beautiful and amazing greenhouse environments have been the ones that kind of just mimic a free-for-all, I don't want to say like wild, tropical environment. They have bananas and then papayas. They have, figs of all, like figs will take over a building and they'll actually press the material right off the brackets, like it can be somewhat of a problem, but you can grow all kinds of literally tree-like crops. We've seen people try things like avocados way up in Idaho in their soil beds. So there are people who really kind of take this and run with it and enjoy the use of beautiful, just domed, loamy worms and composting material and all kinds of things that make a growing space really vibrant with all kinds of diverse crops.
Great. And then we had someone, sorry, did you want to go, Josh?
Oh, go on ahead.
We had someone in the chat say, what's the most water efficient way to water plants in soil?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think this is greenhouse or outside, but we can talk about the differences. Usually a drip system of some sort is your most efficient way to use water in a greenhouse. So I could sit there for 2 hours and spray hose, but that is not efficient for me, my time, nor is it efficient for the plants. I'm just getting everything wet. A specific drip system, which I'm actually going to try and share, but this is a new computer and I'm not quite sure what's going on with it. So tell me, no, it's not going to work. But a drip system, you have like usually a 5/8 inch line, and then you'll just plug a spaghetti hose into it at every plant. And that way, every plant, you can put a certain emitter on it, a 1/2 gallon, a 1/4 gallon per hour. And that water hits one spot on the soil. And it doesn't look like much on the surface, but it spreads underground. And it's a very effective way to be water conscious while using soil. So, in Colorado, all my gardens, every plant, depending on what it is, gets a drip line or two. But I've never like open watering because we don't have a lot of water. It's very hot and dry. So any water on the surface, it's just gone. The plants don't get it, just goes away. So drip systems are the best. Now, if you go into a greenhouse, and we're doing the school greenhouse right now in Montana, they're growing in soil, which is pretty rare for a commercial greenhouse. And it's a fully sealed greenhouse. So this has cooling. It's not vented. It actually has mechanical cooling through heat pumps and full water recapture. So now they're going to water into the soil, and some of that water is going to drain away to the, I don't know, aquifer or wherever it goes. but anything that the plant moves into the air will be recaptured and reused. And so while soil isn't your most water efficient system, there are ways to make it more water efficient than traditionally thought of in a soil-based system. Was the other question nutrition?
There was a question on the difference in food quality between soil-based aquaponic and hydroponic.
Okay, so this is like, you know, I wish I was a food nutrition scientist, but I am not. I have theories, and they go like healthy soil equals healthy plants, and crappy soil doesn't. So if you're growing if you're a soil builder, which is really what a good farmer is, and you have healthy soil and it is alive and has the bacteria that are breaking down things, and there's a mutually beneficial relationship between bacteria in the soil and the roots, and hopefully some mycorrhizal fungus networks, and who knows what's going on. It's way over my head. That produces, in my mind, and again, this is my personal opinion and like a deep-seated belief, healthy food out of soil. That's how you do it. I think the next best thing would probably be an aquaponic system, because there's poop in the mix and there's bacteria in the mix. And as weird as it is, poop equals health. That's just like, there's a longer chain than that, but that's where it goes, right?
That was great, Josh.
You heard it here first.
And then I think the last one is hydroponics. And, you know, we talk about this all the time, where you're using a chemical fertilizer, and sometimes you've got these vertical LED indoor grows, so it's not real sunlight, and chemical fertilizers, and you know, the food looks amazing and it's probably still pretty nutritious. A lot of that's happening in the seed, but what you feed it matters. Now, I can't quantify these things, and we should be talking to someone who can at some point, because that would be a fun conversation. But that's just how I break down plant nutrition for myself.
So I'll jump in here for 1 second, because we've actually had plant sap analysis. The tissue is analyzed, and when the tissue is analyzed, it will tell you like a Brix index, for example, which will give you a sweetness factor or qualities of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, boron, zinc, manganese, iron, etc. So each plant has its own profile. Plants that are dark in colors, so reds, orange, the purple color of a cabbage, for example, a deep orange of a pumpkin, the deep greens in things like kale, the bright rainbow colors of collards and shards. Like, these are things that are indications of nutrients. Those plants, if you ever buy a head of romaine, for example, and it's white almost all the way through, that indicates that it's washed out and leached of almost all its nutrient qualities. The other factor associated with this, beyond the fertilizer's input, is the fact that when something is picked and then consumed, those nutrients remain in the plant. If plants are commonly in a conventional environment, are picked in a field, they're put into a cooling truck, for example, they're moved to a packing shed, they're put into plastic, they're refrigerated, they're sent on trucks, they're stored in coolers, they're distributed to Walmart, they're left in packages for a week on the shelf. The nutrient quality of that plant is pretty much non-existent by the time you get it in your hand, because all of the nutrient has basically just has been zapped out of the plant over all of that refrigeration and long haul, etc. Not to mention some of the food safety considerations. So the sooner you can eat it after you harvest it, the more nutrient dense it's going to be. And a final thought on that, although it's not super practical, if you can eat your greens in a baby form, like microgreens, alfalfa shoots, if you juice them, for example, and you eat them in their youngest form, that's the most nutrient dense food you could eat. But it's just not practical, because you'd have to eat 1 million of them to make a salad or a juice or a meal or something like that. So those are some thoughts, but
that's a really, I think I love what you did. Like, and we do it, and I know we do it with you guys sometimes. We're landing, we don't traditionally do huge greenhouses, right? We do small to mid-sized commercial facilities that are close to populations that need food.
Yeah.
And that's the coolest part, is that when someone harvests your lettuce out of our greenhouse in Gunnison, Colorado, where they would see fresh greens for 9 months of the year, if it wasn't for a greenhouse, maybe 12, 11, they get that lettuce that day.
Yeah.
And that's really, really important, that I completely glossed over.
Yeah.
Thank you for that. That was a lot of great information. Another question we got in the chat, someone was wondering about the difference in overall humidity in the greenhouse between soil-based aquaponic and hydroponic growing and humidity management.
Yeah, I mean, I can start with that. So it really depends on how you're watering. So if you're open watering in soil, your humidity levels are going to, fluctuate like crazy because the water's being absorbed into the atmosphere. And then, in the Aquaponic Source system, the water's mostly covered, but there's still, there's a lot of water in the greenhouse. Some hydroponic systems, there's not so much water. It's oftentimes a thin film of water. But for us at Ceres, anyways, that goes into system design. So when we are designing a greenhouse, it's how much water is in the facility. We're going to calculate rates of water take up based on water temps and what water is available to be picked up by the air. And we're going to design dehumidification systems and sometimes humidification systems that are appropriate to the need of the plant or the grower. We're in Colorado, and so oftentimes we get too dry, which is crazy to think about, but when it's hot air, relative humidity drops. So warm air, it's a ratio. And so when the air is hot, RH is lower. And that can be a stressor on plants. Too dry. Sometimes we have people who are like, I have gnats, I've got all kinds of things, but plants don't look good. And no one thinks about it, but it's too dry sometimes. And so we can actually add humidity, which is a real thing. We do it a lot. But that's a systems design question. And that all happens, before a greenhouse is ever built. But I don't think it really matters across the growing systems. It's more about the systems in the greenhouse that are there to handle it, to help maintain ideally steady relative humidity throughout a day. And really the hard part in the greenhouse is at night, when the temps cool and a lot of water wants to fall out of the air, is the most important factor.
Hank in the chat asked, sorry, go ahead.
Real quick, while you're here, do you see, in your system, you've got foam over all the water. Do you know like how much is transpiration, how much is open absorption into the air? Like, is that something or is that just?
The statistics would only be practical to the location and the building. And the hard part of that is, in dry Colorado, if we're in the middle of winter, oddly, humidity tends to build up most in wintertime because it's cold outside, it's warm inside, and the building gets buttoned up and there's not a lot of air circulation or exchange. And so everything in the room is just staying in the room. And the cold outside, warm inside makes things drip literally from lots of surfaces. So that humidity gets to a higher point. In a hot and humid environment like Georgia or Alabama, Florida, places like that, they have the different greenhouse designing principles just because they're trying to get as much humidity out of the building as possible. Whereas, as Josh pointed out, in Colorado, we turn on our fans and we're literally sucking humidity out of the room in the summer. The plants are desiccating and drying out because the humidity levels are low. So I don't think you could get this is the way it is but you're right, big deep water cultures have a lot of water. That water's covered. Plants transpire. The bigger the plant, the more transpiration. And I just heard at a conference in Texas this last week that plants have their own evaporative cooling. So the more plant mass you might have in a building, the more internal evaporative cooling function is taking place in there. Pretty interesting.
Yeah, very interesting. We have about 5 minutes left, and I wanted to get to this last question before I close us out. What are the, maybe a couple minute answer, what are the best systems in terms of energy efficiency in northern climates?
I guess for energy efficiency, you would have to look at, do you need to heat or do you have other mechanisms? So one of the cool things, and Josh can speak to that, that Ceres does is kind of these climate battery arrangement, the ground to air heat transfer, which uses small air mechanisms to help push warm air through the building or cooling in the summer. But instead of using a whole bunch of natural gas or propane and then generating the carbon emissions from that, you're using more of how does the earth work and how can we use Mother Nature to some extent to help with that.
Yeah, I sometimes questions beget more questions. So mine would be, what do you consider efficient?
Right.
If we're just trying to keep the bills low, that's one answer. But if we're trying to produce the most food for the least amount of money, that's a different answer. And so it really depends on where we are, what we're trying to do. Hydroponics, aquaponics, there's a program, it's just a little more systemic, where when we're working with the Aquaponics Source on the greenhouse and we know the size of the greenhouse, I get a big old spreadsheet from these guys that basically say, if it's done right, you're going to be harvesting 1,200 head of lettuce a week. That is a very effective and usually efficient system based on the inputs. But your inputs, whether it's, whatever it is, pumps and all kinds of things, is going to be maybe more expensive than a soil grow, where you don't have any of those things to deal with, but you might not be producing as much food. So I would break it more down into cost per whatever of food. And that's how I would figure out what is or isn't efficient.
Great. Well, we are right here at the end of our session. I wanted to really quickly thank you so much, Tawnya, for being on today. We've learned so much information about aquaponics. I wanted to quickly share just 1 second. Can you guys see this page? Sorry. Can you? Okay. If your question didn't get answered and you'd like to reach out to either Ceres or the Aquaponic Source, here are our contact information. If you have a more in-depth question about your project specifically, we do offer consulting services. So if you'd like more in-depth professional help, please reach out to us and we can send you more information on those services, pricing, etc. But yeah, thank you so much. That was a great session. Everything was recorded, so we'll be sending this out if you'd like to access it later. And yeah, thank you for joining.
Thank you, Tawnya. That was fun.
Thank you. It was wonderful. Thank you very much.
All right. Have a great rest of your Thursday.
Bye.
Bye.